Welcome to Tales in the Dark. I know many of you enjoy relaxing with these videos, so I recommend turning down the volume until my voice is barely audible. It'll make the experience even more soothing. Before you close your eyes, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Over 99% of viewers aren't subscribed. It costs you nothing, but it's an enormous support for us to keep creating these relaxing stories. Thank you and enjoy listening. Story 1. The wind moved through the ancient pines like a whisper, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and winter's approaching chill. I stood at the edge of the gravel path, my boots crunching softly against fallen needles as I gazed at the weathered structure before me. The house had belonged to my grandmother, though I had never visited during her lifetime. Now, after her passing, it fell to me to sort through what remained. The forest pressed close around the building, creating a natural barrier that seemed to hold the rest of the world at bay. No birds sang in the branches overhead, and even the wind seemed to lose its voice as it approached the house's weather-beaten walls. The silence was absolute, like a thick blanket draped over everything. I retrieved the old brass key from my coat pocket, its weight substantial against my palm. The porch steps creaked beneath my feet, each board speaking in its own distinct voice as I made my way to the front door. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, as if the house had been expecting me. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of old wood and something else. Something sweet and familiar that I couldn't quite place. Dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light that filtered through the windows, creating shifting patterns on the hardwood floors. The furniture stood draped in white sheets, like silent ghosts keeping their vigil. I moved through the room slowly, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Each space held its own particular quality of silence. The living room felt expectant, as if the covered furniture might at any moment shed its shrouds and reveal its secrets. The kitchen retained traces of warmth, despite having been cold for months. As I explored, I began to notice small details that seemed out of place. A chair that faced the wrong direction. A drawer left slightly ajar. These subtle imperfections nagged at the edges of my consciousness, like a word forgotten mid-sentence. I told myself it was natural for a house to shift and settle over time, yet something about these minor discrepancies felt deliberate. The afternoon light began to fade, and I realized I would need to turn on some lamps. I found an old crystal table lamp in the living room and clicked its switch. The bulb flickered to life, casting a warm glow that somehow made the shadows deeper. As I removed the sheet from an antique armchair, I noticed something tucked between the cushions, a small leather-bound book with no title on its spine. The book's pages were filled with my grandmother's neat handwriting, dated entries spanning decades. Most were mundane observations about daily life, but as I leafed through the pages, certain passages caught my eye. She wrote about hearing music when there should have been none, about objects that moved between visits, about reflections in mirrors that didn't quite match what they should have shown. The wind picked up outside, making the house creak and settle around me. I sank deeper into the armchair, drawn into my grandmother's words. She described the silence of the forest, how it seemed to deepen with each passing year. She noted how the trees grew closer to the house, their branches reaching like fingers toward the windows. And she wrote about the dreams of walking through the house at night and finding rooms that hadn't been there before. As darkness fell, I became aware of how the quality of silence had changed. It felt thicker now, more attentive. The shadows cast by the lamp seemed to move independently of their source, and I could have sworn I heard the soft sound of footsteps on the floor above, though I knew I was alone. I turned to a passage near the end of the journal, dated just weeks before my grandmother's passing. Her usually steady handwriting had become shakier, but her words remained clear. The house knows. It has always known. It keeps its secrets in the silence, in the spaces between heartbeats. I've come to understand that we don't own this place. We're simply its caretakers. The forest gives it strength, and in return, it guards something ancient, something that should remain undisturbed. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I turned quickly, but found only empty space. The lamplight flickered, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a mirror on the opposite wall. Only it wasn't quite my reflection. The figure I saw stood at a slightly different angle, and its eyes seemed to hold a deep, knowing expression I knew wasn't on my own face. I returned my attention to the journal, but the words seemed to shift on the page, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. The silence pressed in, becoming almost physical in its intensity. I could feel it gathering around me, curious, evaluating. In the kitchen, a cabinet door opened with a soft creak. I remained in my chair, heart beating steadily, knowing that investigating would only break whatever delicate balance existed in this moment. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. The house knows. The temperature in the room dropped subtly, and I watched as my breath formed small clouds in the air. The lamp light dimmed and brightened in a rhythm that reminded me of breathing. From somewhere deep within the walls came a sound like the settling of old wood, but it carried a musicality that no random house noise should possess. I found myself speaking softly into the silence, though I hadn't planned to. "I understand now," I said, and my words seemed to hang in the air like frost. "I'm not here to change anything. I'm here to learn." The silence shifted, becoming less oppressive, more welcoming. The shadows retreated slightly, and the temperature gradually returned to normal. I felt something settle around me, not a presence exactly, but an acceptance. The house had taken my measure and found me worthy of its confidence. As the night deepened, I continued reading my grandmother's journal. She wrote of the patterns in the silence, the way the house moved through its own cycles like a living thing. She documented the subtle signs that indicated its moods, the way certain doors would stick when it was restless, how the air would grow thick with the scent of pine needles when it was content. I realized that I would not be selling the house as I had originally planned. Like my grandmother before me, I had become part of its story. The forest's silence had claimed me, drawing me into its ancient rhythms. The house's secrets would remain safe, passed down through generations of caretakers who understood the value of silence, the importance of keeping certain mysteries undisturbed. The lamplight steadied, casting a warm glow that felt almost approving. Outside, the wind had died completely, leaving the forest in perfect stillness. I closed the journal and placed it carefully on a nearby table. In the quiet, I could feel the house settling around me, adjusting to my presence, accepting me as its new guardian. From that night forward, the house in the silent woods became my home. I learned its patterns, came to understand its moods, and kept its secrets. Sometimes, in the deepest part of night, I would wake to the sound of soft music playing from empty rooms, or catch glimpses of impossible reflections in the mirrors. But I never felt afraid. The silence had become my companion, and in its depths, I found a peace I had never known existed. The forest continues to press closer, its ancient pines standing sentinel around the house. And in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moments between sleeping and waking, the house whispers its stories to those who know how to listen. We are its caretakers, my grandmother and I, guardians of a silence that holds more wisdom than words could ever express. And so I remain, in this house where the shadows breathe and the silence speaks, keeping watch over mysteries that are better left unexplained. For some secrets are meant to stay hidden in the quiet places of the world, preserved in the endless silence of the woods. Story 2. The soft glow of twilight painted the ancient woods in shades of purple and gold as I navigated the narrow road before me. My car's headlights seemed to fade into the thick mist that had settled over the landscape, creating an ethereal atmosphere that made the world feel distant and dreamlike. The gentle purr of the engine and the occasional crunch of leaves beneath the tires provided a soothing rhythm to my solitary journey. I hadn't intended to venture this far from the main highway, but a series of unmarked detours had led me deeper into these forgotten back roads. The GPS had long since lost its signal, leaving me to rely on my intuition and the fading light of day. Strangely, I felt no anxiety about my situation, only a peculiar sense of peace, as if I were being guided by an unseen hand. The road curved gently through the woods, and as I rounded a bend, the trees began to thin. Through gaps in the foliage, I caught glimpses of old stone walls and weathered wooden fences. The mist parted like a theater curtain, revealing what appeared to be the remnants of a small village nestled in a valley below. Something about the scene pulled at me, like a half-remembered dream. The village seemed frozen in time, with its slate-roofed cottages and cobblestone streets untouched by modern development. Chimney stacks rose above the rooftops, though no smoke emerged from them. Windows reflected the dying light of day, their glass surfaces clouded with age but somehow still intact. I eased my foot off the accelerator, allowing the car to coast to a natural stop at the village's entrance. The engine's whisper faded to silence, leaving me enveloped in the hushed atmosphere of this forgotten place. The air that drifted through my partially opened window carried the scent of damp earth, old stone, and something else. Something sweet and familiar that I couldn't quite identify. As I stepped out of the car, my shoes met the worn cobblestones with a soft tap that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The mist swirled around my ankles, cool and oddly comforting. The village stretched before me like a painting, its colors muted but somehow more vivid than they should have been in the fading light. The buildings stood in neat rows, their facades a mix of stone and timber that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. Wooden signs hung motionless above doorways, their painted letters faded beyond recognition. Flower boxes clung to windowsills, holding the dried remains of what might have once been vibrant gardens. I began walking down the main street, drawn forward by an inexplicable curiosity. My footsteps created a gentle rhythm against the cobblestones, accompanied by the soft rustle of leaves that danced across my path. The air grew thicker with moisture, and tiny droplets of water began to collect on my clothing, though I couldn't tell if it was rain or merely the condensing mist. A gentle breeze carried the sound of wind chimes from somewhere deeper in the village. The melody was delicate and otherworldly, like crystal bells being played underwater. I followed the sound, passing by buildings that seemed to watch my progress with their empty windows. The village square opened up before me, centered around an ancient well with a weathered wooden cover. The wind chimes I had heard hung from the eaves of what appeared to be an old shop, their glass surfaces catching what little light remained and scattering it in prismatic patterns across the square. As I approached the well, I noticed something unusual about my surroundings. The mist, which had been steadily thickening, now moved with purpose, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. It formed shapes that dissolved before I could fully comprehend them, like trying to remember the details of a dream upon waking. The well drew me closer, its wooden cover bearing intricate carvings that became clearer as I approached. Spiraling patterns and symbols I didn't recognize decorated its surface, worn smooth by countless years of weather and touch. I ran my fingers along the carvings, feeling a subtle warmth that seemed at odds with the cool evening air. A sound caught my attention, the soft creak of a door swinging on old hinges. I turned to see one of the shop doors had drifted open, revealing a darkness that seemed deeper than the growing night. The interior beckoned with the same inexplicable pull that had drawn me to the village. Inside, my eyes adjusted to reveal shelves lined with glass jars of various sizes. Each contained something different: dried flowers, herbs, and objects I couldn't identify in the dim light. Dust motes danced in a beam of fading daylight that filtered through the window, creating a golden pathway through the room. The shop held an impossible tidiness, as if someone had just stepped away moments ago, despite the clear signs of age that marked everything within. On the counter sat an open ledger, its pages filled with elegant handwriting that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. As I leaned closer to examine the writing, a soft glow began to emanate from the jars around me. It started subtly, so subtle that at first I thought it was simply my eyes playing tricks in the low light. But the illumination grew stronger, each jar developing its own unique color and intensity. The light created a gentle aurora throughout the shop, casting soft shadows that danced across the walls. The colors shifted and merged, creating patterns that reminded me of northern lights I had once seen in photographs. The effect was mesmerizing, and I found myself swaying slightly, as if moved by music I couldn't quite hear. A whisper of movement caught my attention, not a sound, but more like the suggestion of sound. I turned toward the back of the shop, where a doorway led to another room. The glow from the jars seemed to flow in that direction, like a luminous stream guiding my path. The back room revealed itself to be a workshop of sorts. A large wooden table dominated the space, its surface covered in tools, bottles, and more of the mysterious jars. But what drew my attention was the book that lay open on the table, its pages filled with the same shifting text I had seen in the ledger. As I approached the table, the words on the page began to still, becoming legible for brief moments before flowing into new patterns. I caught fragments of sentences about the village, its history, its purpose, and most intriguingly, its inhabitants. The text spoke of people who existed between moments, of a community that lived in the spaces between breaths. The light from the front room had followed me, and now the jars in the workshop began to glow as well. The illumination grew stronger, but remained soft and soothing, never harsh enough to break the dreamlike quality of my surroundings. The colors seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, creating a symphony of light that filled the space. A movement in my peripheral vision drew my attention to a mirror hanging on the far wall. In its reflection, I saw the shop as it might have been years ago, filled with people in clothes from another time, going about their business as if it were any normal day. But when I turned to look directly at the room, it remained empty, save for myself and the glowing jars. I looked back at the mirror, and the scene had changed. Now it showed the village square outside, but transformed by the presence of dozens of figures that moved through the mist like dancers in a sway, elaborate performance. They seemed solid and ethereal at the same time, their forms simultaneously clear and impossible to focus on. The book on the table had fallen open to a new page, and this time the text remained still long enough for me to read a full passage. It spoke of a choice the villagers had made long ago, to exist in a place between time, where the boundary between what was and what could be remained forever fluid. They had created a sanctuary where the past and present flowed together like watercolors on wet paper. As I read, I became aware of a presence behind me, not threatening, but patient and observant. In the mirror's reflection, I saw a figure standing at my shoulder, wearing clothes that could have been from any era in the past century. But when I turned, there was only the soft glow of the jars and the dancing mist that had followed me inside. The figure in the mirror smiled, a warm, welcoming expression that carried no malice. Its lips moved, and though no sound reached my ears, I understood the message. I had been expected. The village revealed itself to those who needed to find it, to those who carried a piece of its mystery within them without knowing it. I felt a subtle shift in the air, and the quality of light changed once again. The glow from the jars began to pulse more slowly, like a breathing pattern meant to guide me into meditation. The text in the book started to flow once more, but now it seemed to be writing itself anew, adding my own story to its pages. The mirror's reflection showed more figures gathering in the shop, all wearing similar warm expressions. They moved about their business as if I were not there, yet somehow I knew they were aware of my presence. The scene was both impossible and utterly natural, like the logic of a dream that makes perfect sense until you try to explain it upon waking. Time seemed to flow differently in that space. The light outside the windows remained in a perpetual state of dusk, never quite fading to full darkness. The mist continued its dance through the village streets, carrying with it whispers of conversations from every era the village had witnessed. I found myself moving back through the shop, though I couldn't remember deciding to do so. The glowing jars dimmed slightly as I passed, their light following me like curious spirits. The mirror's reflection showed the figures watching my departure with knowing smiles, their forms becoming more translucent as I neared the door. Stepping back into the village square, I noticed that the mist had transformed. It now carried the same gentle luminescence as the jars in the shop, creating a landscape of living light that flowed through the streets like a river of stars. The wind chimes continued their crystalline song, but now it seemed to harmonize with a deeper music that emanated from the village itself. The well at the center of the square had changed as well. The carvings on its cover now glowed with a soft inner light, revealing patterns that seemed to move and shift when viewed from different angles. The symbols told stories in a language that required no translation, tales of the village and its inhabitants, of the choice they had made and the peace they had found. As I made my way back to my car, I felt no urge to hurry. The village had shared its secret with me, and I understood that I could find my way back if I needed to. The mist parted before me, its luminous tendrils brushing against my clothes like farewell caresses. Settling back into the driver's seat, I watched as the mist began to thicken once more, slowly obscuring the village from view. The wind chime's song lingered in the air, growing fainter but never quite fading completely. I started the engine, its soft hum mixing with the lingering echoes of the village's music. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a moment, I saw the village glowing like a constellation that had settled on Earth, its lights pulsing in time with the same rhythm that had filled the shop. Then the mist closed in completely, and the village returned to its place between moments, waiting for the next traveler who needed to find it. The road ahead seemed clearer now, though I knew the village had changed something fundamental in how I saw the world. The mist gradually thinned as I drove, but I carried with me the memory of that luminous place where time moved like water, and stories wrote themselves in shifting text. The gentle purr of my car's engine provided a steady rhythm as I made my way back to familiar roads. The experience settled into my memory like a treasured dream, its edges soft but its essence unchanging. I knew that somewhere behind me, in a fold of reality that existed between seconds, the village continued its eternal twilight dance, its inhabitants moving through their endless moment with peaceful purpose. Story 3. The autumn wind carried whispers through the old pine trees, their branches swaying gently against the darkening sky. I had always found comfort in those natural sounds, the rustle of leaves, the creaking of ancient wood, the soft murmur of the forest at dusk. But tonight, something about those familiar sounds felt different, as if the wind itself was trying to form words. I sat in my grandmother's rocking chair on the wraparound porch, wrapped in her hand-knitted blanket, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the clouds in shades of violet and deep blue. The house behind me stood silent, its weathered wooden walls holding decades of memories. My grandmother had lived here until her passing 3 months ago, and now the property was mine, along with all its peculiarities. The first unusual whisper came as twilight settled in, barely distinguishable from the natural sounds of the evening. It might have been my name, or perhaps just the wind playing tricks with my ears. The temperature dropped steadily, bringing with it the crisp scent of pine needles and approaching rain. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender that still clung to its fibers. My grandmother had always said the wind spoke to those who knew how to listen. As a child, I had dismissed her words as the fanciful stories of an old woman. Now, as I watched the shadows lengthen across the porch boards, I wondered if there had been more truth to her tales than I had realized. The second whisper was clearer, like a voice carried from far away. It reminded me of the way sound travels across water on a still night, distant yet distinctly present. The words were impossible to make out, but the cadence was unmistakably human. I found myself leaning forward in the rocking chair, straining to catch whatever message the wind might be trying to deliver. Inside the house, the old grandfather clock began its evening ritual, its deep chimes marking the hour. 7 melodic notes resonated through the walls, each one seeming to hang in the air longer than natural. As the last tone faded, the wind picked up again, and this time I was certain I heard words among its sussurrations. Listen carefully, it seemed to say, the syllables floating past like autumn leaves. There are things you need to know. My hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. Instead, I felt a deep sense of anticipation, as if I were on the verge of understanding something important. The rocking chair creaked beneath me, its gentle motion matching the rhythm of the swaying trees. The sky had deepened to indigo now, with the first stars beginning to emerge. Their light seemed unusually bright, casting a silvery glow across the landscape. In the garden below the porch, grandmother's wind chimes tinkled softly, adding their voice to the evening's strange chorus. Your grandmother knew, the wind whispered more distinctly now. She left something for you to find. I closed my eyes, focusing on the sound. The voice in the wind was neither male nor female, young nor old. It simply was, like the rustle of pages in an ancient book or the sound of waves against a distant shore. Rising from the rocking chair, I let the blanket fall away. The wooden boards beneath my feet felt warm despite the cooling air, as if they retained some memory of the day's sunlight. I made my way to the door, pausing with my hand on the brass handle. The metal was cool against my palm, and for a moment I hesitated, wondering if I should simply go home and return in the daylight. But the wind spoke again, gentle yet insistent. Time flows differently in the spaces between moments. She taught us this, and now we teach you. The door opened silently, though I knew its hinges usually creaked. The interior of the house was dim but not dark, filled with the kind of soft twilight that makes familiar objects seem slightly strange. Grandmother's collection of antique mirrors caught what little light remained, creating pools of silvery reflection on the walls. I moved through the house with careful steps, though I knew every floorboard and corner. The air inside held the lingering scent of dried herbs and old books, grandmother's perpetual perfume. As I passed the kitchen, I noticed her tea kettle on the stove, though I was certain I hadn't left it there during my last visit. The wind's voice followed me inside, now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In the study, it guided, behind the painting of the winter forest. I knew the painting well, a large landscape that had hung above grandmother's writing desk for as long as I could remember. She had painted it herself, though she never told me when. The scene depicted a snow-covered forest at dusk, with dark trees standing like sentinels against a pearl-gray sky. I had always found it both beautiful and slightly unsettling, as if the trees might begin to move when no one was watching. Standing before it now, I noticed details I had never seen before. Tiny figures seemed to dance between the trees, barely visible against the snow. Had they always been there, or were my eyes playing tricks in the fading light? With trembling fingers, I lifted the painting from its hooks. Behind it, the wall appeared solid at first glance, but as I ran my hands over the surface, I felt a slight give in one panel. Pressing gently, I heard a soft click, and a small compartment swung open. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. A ribbon bookmark protruded from somewhere near the middle, and a faint scent of lavender rose from its pages. Next to it sat a small wooden box, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change in the dim light. "She wrote everything down," the wind whispered, its voice now so close it might have been speaking directly into my ear. "The patterns in the stars, the rhythms of the earth, the spaces where time folds in on itself, all of it, waiting for you." I lifted the journal with reverent hands, aware that I was touching something precious and powerful. As I opened it to the marked page, grandmother's familiar handwriting flowed across the paper in elegant curves. "My dearest grandchild," the first line read, "if you are reading this, then the winds have finally found you ready. There are things about our family, about this house, about the very nature of reality, that you need to understand." The wind chimes in the garden played a complex melody, one that seemed to match the rhythm of my heartbeat. Outside, the stars had grown brighter, their light streaming through the windows in silver ribbons. As I settled into grandmother's reading chair, the journal open in my lap and the mysterious box beside me, the wind's whispers grew clearer. "Read carefully," it advised. "Time moves differently here, and there is much to learn." I began to read, grandmother's words flowing from page to page like a river of memory. She wrote of ancient knowledge passed down through generations, of winds that carried messages across time, of stars that sang to those who knew their names. She described doors that opened onto impossible places and moments that stretched into eternity. The wooden box remained unopened beside me, its carvings catching the starlight. Sometimes when I glanced at it from the corner of my eye, I could swear the patterns had rearranged themselves, forming new configurations that hinted at deeper mysteries. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time had indeed become fluid, just as the wind had promised. I read of grandmother's discoveries, her experiments with the boundaries between what was and what could be. She wrote of the wind's voices, of how they had guided her just as they now guided me. When I finally looked up from the journal, the night had deepened, but the darkness felt alive with possibility rather than threat. The wind still whispered through the house, but now I understood its language better. It spoke of secrets waiting to be discovered, of knowledge passed down through generations, of magic that existed in the quiet spaces between moments. I reached for the wooden box, its surface warm beneath my fingers. The carvings seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and as I prepared to open it, the wind's voice grew stronger. "Welcome," it said, "to your inheritance." The box's lid opened smoothly, revealing its contents. But that is a story for another time, when the wind is right and the stars align just so. For now, let it be known that in an old house surrounded by pine trees, where time moves differently, and the wind carries whispers of ancient secrets, a new chapter was beginning. The last thing I remember from that night was the sound of the wind chimes playing their ethereal melody, the weight of the journal in my lap, and the feeling that I had finally found my place in a world far more mysterious and wonderful than I had ever imagined. Some say that on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the wind moves through the pine trees just right, you can still hear whispers carrying fragments of forgotten knowledge. But only those who know how to listen, who understand that magic lives in the spaces between moments, can truly hear what the wind has to say. And so the story continues, carried on the autumn breeze, waiting for those who are ready to hear it. just as my grandmother waited for me. The wind still whispers its secrets, and in the old house with its wraparound porch, time still flows differently, carrying echoes of mysteries yet to be revealed. Story 4. The grandfather clock in my study struck midnight, its deep resonance filling the room with a sound that seemed to linger longer than usual. I sat in my leather armchair, surrounded by the warm glow of an old brass lamp, watching shadows dance across the mahogany bookshelves. A gentle rain tapped against the windows, creating a soothing rhythm that matched the steady beating of my heart. I held an old leather-bound journal in my hands, its pages worn and yellowed with age. The book had appeared on my doorstep that morning, wrapped in brown paper with no return address or note. Only my name was written on the package in elegant, flowing script that stirred something deep within my memory. The leather felt warm beneath my fingertips, almost alive. As I opened the journal, a familiar scent wafted up. Old paper, dried ink, and something else, something that reminded me of autumn leaves and wood smoke. My eyes were drawn to the first page, where the same flowing handwriting filled the cream-colored paper. "My dearest friend," the journal began, "by the time you read these words, I will have already started walking the path. I trust you'll understand why I had to return these memories to you." A chill ran down my spine, though the room remained comfortably warm. The words sparked something in my mind, a path through autumn woods, golden light filtering through red and orange leaves, the crunch of frost beneath my feet. But try as I might, I couldn't place when or where this memory belonged. I turned the page, and a pressed flower fell into my lap, a dried violet, its purple hue faded but still visible. The sight of it made my head swim with half-formed memories. Laughter echoing through trees, the sweet scent of wildflowers, and a voice calling my name from somewhere ahead on a winding trail. "We discovered the path on a Tuesday," the journal continued. "Remember how the morning mist clung to the ground like a silk veil? You said it reminded you of dreams made tangible. If only we had known then what walking that path would mean." My fingers trembled slightly as I turned another page. The writing described a series of walks taken along this mysterious path, each entry more detailed than the last. With every word I read, more fragments of memory surfaced, but they felt strange, as if I were watching scenes from someone else's life played out behind my eyes. There were descriptions of standing stones covered in symbols that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, of flowers that bloomed at midnight, their petals glowing with a soft blue light, of whispered conversations with shadows that moved independently of any light source. "The path changes everyone who walks it," one entry read, "but you changed it too. Your presence altered its nature in ways I still don't fully understand. Perhaps that's why they chose you." Who were they? Why couldn't I remember? The question echoed in my mind as I continued reading. The lamp's light seemed to dim, though I hadn't touched it. Outside, the rain fell harder, creating a curtain of sound that isolated me in my reading. The journal spoke of meetings with strange figures in the woods, people whose faces couldn't quite be remembered after they'd passed. It mentioned doors that appeared in the trunks of ancient trees, leading to places that shouldn't exist. With each description, more memories stirred, but they remained just out of reach, like words on the tip of my tongue. "You began to change after our 7th walk," the journal noted. "Small things at first. You could name flowers we'd never seen before. You knew when it would rain without checking the weather. You started humming melodies that made the air shimmer." I realized I was humming one of those melodies now, though I couldn't remember learning it. The sound made the shadows in the corners of the room retreat slightly, and the lamp's light took on a golden hue that reminded me of autumn sunsets. As I delved deeper into the journal, the entries became more urgent, the handwriting more hurried. "The path is calling you more frequently now. Last night, I watched you sleepwalk to your back door 3 times. Each time you tried to open it, murmuring about following the violet lights. I had to hide your keys. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, where my house keys usually resided. They weren't there. When had I last seen them? The thought slipped away like water through cupped hands. They say the path chooses certain people, another entry read. Those who can walk between worlds without losing themselves. But I'm watching you lose yourself in a different way, not to the path's magic, but to its memories. Every time you return, you remember less of your old life and more of what lies beyond the standing stones. The room felt different now, larger somehow, as if the walls had quietly stepped back while I was reading. The sound of rain seemed to come from very far away, replaced by a closer sound like leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. I made a choice today. Read one of the final entries. I asked them to take your memories of the path, to save you from what you were becoming. They agreed, but at a price. Someone had to walk the path in your place to maintain the balance. I volunteered. My vision blurred as I read these words, and for a moment I saw 2 scenes simultaneously. My study with its familiar furnishings and a forest path bathed in otherworldly light. The pressed violet in my lap began to glow with a faint purple luminescence. But memories have a way of finding their way home, the last entry began. Like water flowing downhill, like birds returning to their nests. I've watched you these past years, living your normal life, unaware of what you once knew. But the path hasn't forgotten you, and now it's time for you to remember, if you choose to. The final page contained only a short passage. If you wish to remember, take the violet and walk into your garden at midnight. You'll find the path waiting where it always has been, behind the old oak tree. Whether you choose to walk it again is up to you. But know that I'll be waiting at the first standing stone, as I have been all these years. I closed the journal, aware that my hands were shaking. The grandfather clock began to strike midnight again, though it seemed impossible that an hour had passed. The sound was different this time. Each toll seemed to come from a different direction, as if the clock were slowly walking around my study. The violet in my lap pulsed gently with purple light, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat. Through the window, I could see my garden transformed by moonlight and rain. The old oak tree stood like a sentinel at its far end, its branches swaying in a wind I couldn't feel. I stood, the journal in one hand, the violet in the other. The choice lay before me, to remain in my comfortable life of forgetting, or to step out into the rain and remember what I had lost. The path waited, as it always had, just out of sight, but never truly gone. The lamp flickered once and went out, leaving me in darkness broken only by moonlight and the gentle glow of the violet. In that moment of darkness, I heard it, a familiar voice calling my name from somewhere beyond the oak tree, accompanied by the sound of leaves crunching underfoot and the faint melody I had been humming earlier. I walked to my back door, my feet remembering the way despite the darkness. The handle turned easily under my touch. It hadn't been locked after all. As I stepped out into the rain, the violet's glow brightened, illuminating a trail of purple light that led toward the old oak tree. Behind me, the grandfather clock struck its final midnight toll. Ahead, through a gap in reality that had always been there, waiting to be remembered, the path beckoned. And somewhere along it, an old friend waited with all the memories I had lost. I took the first step forward, and the rain turned to golden light around me. The choice had been made. The path had been remembered. And somewhere, in a study that grew more distant with each step, a leather-bound journal lay open on an empty armchair, its pages blank once more, waiting for new memories to be written. Story 5. The gentle sweep of waves against weathered stone filled my ears as I made my way along the coastal path. Night was settling in, bringing with it a fine mist that softened the edges of everything it touched. The old lighthouse stood before me, its white paint peeling away in long strips like shed skin. What remained of its former glory was barely visible in the growing darkness, but something about its solitary silhouette against the darkening sky drew me closer. I hadn't planned to visit the lighthouse that evening. My evening walks usually took me in the opposite direction, toward the fishing village, but tonight something had pulled me here instead. Perhaps it was the unusual stillness in the air, or the way the fog seemed to curl around the base of the tower like fingers grasping at stone. The lighthouse keeper's cottage sat nestled at the base of the tower, its windows dark and empty. Local stories said the last keeper had vanished decades ago, leaving behind a perfectly preserved home that no one had claimed. The door had been locked ever since, or so they said, which is why I stopped in my tracks when I noticed it standing slightly ajar, swaying almost imperceptibly in the evening breeze. The logical part of my mind suggested teenagers had likely broken in, seeking thrills in the abandoned building. Yet something about the way the door moved seemed more purposeful, as if it had been left open as an invitation. The remaining daylight was fading rapidly, and the mist was growing thicker. I should have turned back then, but curiosity drew me forward like a fish caught in a current. The door creaked softly as I pushed it wider, revealing a surprisingly well-preserved interior. Dust covered everything in a thick gray blanket, but otherwise the cottage looked as though its occupant had simply stepped out for a moment. A teacup sat on the kitchen table, its contents long since evaporated. A book lay open on a reading chair, its pages yellow with age. The air inside was cool and carried the mineral scent of the sea. My footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floors as I moved deeper into the cottage. Each room told its own story of abandonment. A carefully made bed with a thin film of dust on its quilt, a desk with a half-written letter still waiting to be finished, a shelf of logbooks meticulously maintained until they suddenly stopped. The last entry was dated decades ago, written in a steady hand. "The light keeps going out. No matter how many times I climb those stairs to relight it, it won't stay lit. Something up there doesn't want it lit." A narrow doorway connected the cottage to the base of the lighthouse tower. The spiral staircase wound upward into darkness, its iron steps still solid despite years of disuse. The railing was smooth beneath my hand, worn by countless ascents of lighthouse keepers before me. As I began to climb, I noticed something peculiar. There was no dust on these steps, as if they had been recently used. The staircase seemed to go on forever, my footsteps creating a hypnotic rhythm that matched the distant sound of waves. Occasionally, a window would appear in the curved wall, offering glimpses of the thickening fog outside. With each turn of the spiral, the windows revealed less and less of the world beyond, until all I could see was a uniform gray mass pressing against the glass. The air grew colder as I climbed, carrying with it a strange metallic taste. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to pulse with a subtle vibration, almost too faint to notice. It reminded me of a heartbeat, slow and steady, as if the entire structure was somehow alive. I found myself matching my breathing to this rhythm without realizing it. When I finally reached the lantern room at the top, I was surprised to find it immaculately clean. The giant Fresnel lens at its center gleamed as if recently polished, its complex array of prisms catching what little light remained and creating dancing patterns on the walls. The glass enclosure that surrounded the room was spotless, offering a clear view of the fog that had now completely enveloped the lighthouse. The logbook's final entry came back to me as I noticed the modern electric bulb at the center of the lens. It looked new, yet it was dark. I found the switch and flipped it, but nothing happened. I tried again and again, but the light refused to come on. The room remained in shadow, illuminated only by the last remnants of twilight filtering through the fog. That's when I noticed the chair. It sat in the corner of the room, facing the lens, and it wasn't empty. A figure sat there, barely visible in the growing darkness. It was transparent, like a photograph that had been left too long in the sun, but its outline was unmistakably that of a person in a lighthouse keeper's uniform. As I watched, frozen in place, the figure slowly turned its head toward me. The face I saw wasn't frightening. It was weathered and tired, with eyes that held decades of solitude within them. The ghost, for that's what it had to be, regarded me with an expression of profound relief, as if it had been waiting a very long time for someone to climb those stairs. Its lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow I understood their meaning. "Will you help me keep the light burning?" I found myself nodding, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was agreeing to. The figure smiled, and in that moment, the electric bulb suddenly flickered to life. The lens began to rotate, sending powerful beams of light out into the fog. The ghost stood, bowed slightly, and faded away like morning mist in sunlight. I've returned to the lighthouse every evening since then. The door is always unlocked for me, and the stairs are always clean. Sometimes when I reach the top, I catch a glimpse of the former keeper in the reflection of the lens, watching as I check the light and ensure it stays burning bright. We never speak. There's no need for words between us. We both understand the importance of keeping the light burning, of guiding ships safely through the darkness. The villagers have started to notice the lighthouse's beam cutting through the night fog again. They whisper about it in the local pub, wondering who has taken up the keeper's duties. I never correct their assumptions that the lighthouse has been officially reactivated. How could I explain that I share my duties with a ghost, that we work together in comfortable silence each night to keep the light burning? On particularly foggy nights, when the beam seems to get swallowed by the thick gray wall surrounding the lighthouse, I sometimes hear whispers carried on the salty breeze. They speak of other lighthouses, other keepers who never left their posts, even after death. They tell of a network of eternal guardians, keeping their lights burning against the darkness, guiding lost souls home. The mechanical parts of the lighthouse never seem to need maintenance or repair. The bulb never burns out, and the lens rotates smoothly without oil. Some nights, I swear I can feel the structure's slow heartbeat more strongly, pulsing in time with the rotation of the light. It's as if the lighthouse itself is alive, sustained by the dedication of its keepers, both living and dead. I've started keeping my own logbook now, recording the quiet nights spent in the lantern room. Sometimes I write about the ghost keeper, describing the way he fades in and out of view like a distant radio signal. Other times, I document the strange patterns I see in the fog, or the mysterious lights that sometimes appear far out at sea. The entries help me make sense of my new reality, this strange partnership I've entered into. What began as an evening walk has become my life's purpose. The lighthouse has claimed me, just as it claimed its previous keeper, but I don't mind. There's a peace in this duty, a satisfaction in knowing that ships still rely on our light to find their way through treacherous waters. The ghost keeper and I have formed an understanding that transcends the boundary between life and death, united in our commitment to keep the light burning. As I write this entry in my logbook, I can feel the ghost keeper's presence nearby. The light rotates steadily, sending its beam out into the night. The fog presses against the windows, thick and mysterious as ever, but it doesn't feel threatening anymore. This is where I belong now, among the eternal guardians of the light. And somehow, I know that long after I'm gone, another walker will find themselves drawn to this lighthouse, ready to take up the duty that never truly ends. The beam cuts through the darkness once more, and I smile, knowing I'm exactly where I need to be. The ghost keeper nods approvingly from his corner, and together we settle in for another night of keeping the light burning guiding lost souls home through the endless fog. Story 6. The gentle patter of rain against the window panes filled the old house with a soft, rhythmic melody. I had inherited this ancestral home just weeks ago, and while its weathered walls held countless memories, something about it felt different tonight. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet as I made my way through the dimly lit hallway, my fingers trailing along the textured wallpaper that had begun to fade with age. My attention was drawn to the ceiling, where a thin cord dangled, the pull string for the attic door. I had noticed it before, but never gave it much thought until now. In the soft glow of the evening light, I could see it swaying ever so slightly, despite the stillness of the air inside. The movement was barely perceptible, like the gentle breathing of a sleeping house. The previous owner, my great-aunt Margaret, had always kept the attic locked. "Some doors are better left closed," she would say with a knowing smile whenever I asked about it as a child. Now, as the sole inhabitant of this grand old house, I found myself drawn to that mysterious space above my head. The key to the attic door hung on a brass hook in the study, untouched for years, gathering dust alongside other forgotten keys. I made my way to the study, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The room smelled of old books and leather, a comforting scent that reminded me of afternoons spent here with Margaret. She would sit in her favorite armchair by the window, reading stories to me while shadows danced across the walls. The key hook was exactly where I remembered it, though the collection had grown smaller over the years. The brass key felt cold and heavy in my palm, its intricate pattern worn smooth by time. As I stood beneath the attic door, a cool draft brushed against my face, carrying with it the faintest trace of lavender, Margaret's favorite scent. The key slipped into the lock with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The door lowered smoothly, without the expected creak of aged hinges. A wooden ladder descended, each rung covered in a thin layer of dust that spoke of years of disuse. The air that drifted down from above carried the weight of forgotten memories, mixed with the musty scent of closed spaces and old wood. My heart beat steadily as I climbed the ladder, each step deliberate and measured. The attic space gradually revealed itself in the beam of my flashlight. A vast room that stretched the length of the house, filled with shapes draped in white sheets like silent ghosts keeping their vigil. The wooden beams above were dark with age, and cobwebs stretched between them like delicate lace. As I moved deeper into the space, my flashlight beam caught something unusual, a path through the dust on the floor, as if someone had walked here recently. But that was impossible. The key had been untouched until now, and I lived alone. The trail led to a corner of the attic where a large mirror stood uncovered, its ornate frame gleaming dully in the low light. The mirror's surface seemed unusually clear, free from the dust that coated everything else. As I approached, the temperature around me dropped noticeably. My breath formed small clouds in the air despite the summer warmth outside. The mirror's surface rippled slightly, like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. Behind me, I heard the soft rustle of fabric. One of the white sheets covering what appeared to be an old dresser had shifted slightly. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in the stillness of the attic, it felt significant. I turned slowly, watching as the sheet settled back into place, its folds arranging themselves with deliberate precision. The flashlight beam revealed something small and white near the dresser, a handwritten note, the paper yellowed with age. The handwriting was familiar, the elegant curves and loops unmistakably Margaret's. The mirror shows what was and what might be. Some reflections are better left unseen. A soft whisper echoed through the attic, too quiet to make out words but clear enough to raise the hair on the back of my neck. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the memory of a voice rather than a sound itself. The lavender scent grew stronger, mixing with the dust and age of the attic. I found myself drawn back to the mirror, its surface now seeming to hold depths beyond its physical boundaries. In its reflection, I saw the attic as it might have been years ago. The sheets were gone, revealing furniture arranged with purpose. A rocking chair swayed gently in a non-existent breeze. The longer I stared, the more details emerged. Books stacked neatly on shelves, old photographs in silver frames, and a small music box perched on a table. The music box in the reflection began to turn, though its real counterpart remained still and silent under its white sheet. A melody drifted through the air, notes so faint they might have been imagination. I recognized the tune, a lullaby Margaret used to hum while she worked in her garden. Movement caught my eye in the mirror, a figure in the background, indistinct but familiar. The shape of the shoulders, the way the head tilted slightly to one side, it reminded me of Margaret. But when I turned to look behind me, I saw only the draped furniture and dancing dust motes in my flashlight beam. The whispers grew clearer, forming words that seemed to float on the edge of comprehension. They spoke of memories, of secrets kept and promises made. Each word carried the weight of years, of stories left untold and questions never asked. The voice or voices seemed to emanate from the very walls of the attic, as if the house itself was trying to communicate. My flashlight flickered, its beam growing weaker. The shadows in the corners of the attic seemed to deepen, but not in a threatening way. Rather, they felt like a gentle reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some questions better left unasked. I noticed a small book resting on a nearby table, its leather cover worn smooth by handling. Opening it revealed Margaret's diary, its pages filled with entries spanning decades. One entry caught my eye, dated just weeks before she passed away. The attic holds more than just memories. It holds time itself, folded and layered like the sheets that cover our past. Some say houses remember. This one remembers everything. The whispers gradually faded, leaving behind a profound silence broken only by the continuing rain outside. The mirror's surface had returned to normal, reflecting only the present moment. The sheets, the dust, and my own wondering face. But something had changed. The attic felt different now, as if it had shared a secret with me, even if I couldn't quite understand its meaning. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something odd about the dust trail I had followed earlier. It now formed a complete circle, though I had only walked in one direction. Next to my own footprints, I could see other, lighter impressions, as if someone had walked here long ago, their steps preserved somehow in the layers of time that filled this space. I carefully locked the attic door behind me, but I knew I would return. The mystery of the locked attic hadn't been solved. Rather, it had deepened into something more profound. The house held its secrets close, revealing them only in whispers and reflections, in the scent of lavender and the echo of a forgotten lullaby. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the rain, I could hear the gentle creaking of floorboards above, like footsteps moving in familiar patterns. The sound was comforting rather than frightening, like the presence of an old friend keeping watch. Sometimes I thought I could catch the faint melody of the music box, drifting down through the layers of the house like a memory set to music. The mystery of the locked attic remained, but perhaps that was how it should be. Some spaces exist between what was and what might be, between memory and possibility. In those spaces, the past never truly fades away. It simply waits, patient and quiet, for someone to turn the key and climb the stairs, ready to whisper its stories to those willing to listen. Story 7. The gentle whisper of wind through ancient pines filled my ears as I walked along the overgrown path. The forest had always been different at twilight, but tonight something stirred in the growing darkness that made the hair on my neck stand on end. Not from fear, exactly, but from a deep awareness that I wasn't alone among these towering sentinels. My footsteps fell softly on the carpet of dried needles, each step releasing the sweet, earthy scent of decomposing plant matter into the cool evening air. The setting sun painted long shadows between the trees, and in the dimming light, the forest seemed to move with a rhythm all its own. In and out, in and out, like breathing. I had walked these paths countless times before as the caretaker of this old-growth forest, but tonight the familiar trails felt somehow altered. The usual markers, a lightning-struck oak, a peculiarly twisted maple, a fallen log covered in luminescent fungi, all seemed slightly out of place, as if the forest had shifted them while I wasn't looking. The air grew thicker as night approached, carrying with it the musty perfume of autumn decay, and something else, something older and more profound. Each breath I took felt heavy with meaning, as if the very air was trying to communicate some ancient secret. The temperature had dropped several degrees since I began my evening rounds, and my breath now formed delicate clouds that danced and swirled before dissipating into the gathering dusk. As I continued deeper into the woods, I noticed the silence first. The usual evening chorus of crickets and night birds had fallen still, replaced by a deep, penetrating quiet that seemed to pulse with its own energy. Then I heard it, a sound so subtle I might have missed it if not for the absolute silence surrounding it, a slow, rhythmic movement of air, like the breathing of some enormous creature. I paused on the path, listening intently. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the entire forest was slowly inhaling and exhaling in perfect synchronization. The branches of the ancient trees swayed gently, though there was no wind. Up and down, in and out, a perfect rhythm that seemed to pull at something deep within my chest, compelling my own breathing to match its hypnotic cadence. The light had faded to a deep blue twilight, and in the growing darkness, I noticed something peculiar about the trees. Their bark seemed to ripple and shift in the failing light, the deep furrows and ridges moving ever so slightly with each forest-wide breath. I reached out to touch the nearest trunk, my fingers trembling slightly as they made contact with the rough surface. The bark was warm beneath my touch, much warmer than it should have been in the cool evening air. And there, beneath my fingertips, I felt it, a subtle movement like a pulse. Not the quick, sharp rhythm of a human heartbeat, but something far slower and more ancient. One beat every minute or so, sending waves of warmth up through the living wood. As I stood there, hand pressed against the tree, I began to notice other changes in my surroundings. The ground beneath my feet felt less solid somehow, as if it too was moving with the forest's breath. The very air seemed to thicken and thin in waves, like the gentle tide of some invisible ocean. And most remarkably, the darkness between the trees had taken on a quality I had never seen before. It seemed to swirl and eddy, carrying pinpricks of bioluminescence that danced like stars in a living galaxy. My initial unease had given way to a profound sense of wonder. This was not something to fear, but rather something to witness, a glimpse into the true nature of this ancient place. The forest was revealing itself to me, sharing a secret that had always been here, hidden just beneath the surface of ordinary reality. I found myself walking again, though I couldn't recall making the conscious decision to move. My feet carried me deeper into the woods, following a path I didn't recognize but somehow knew was right. The breathing of the forest had completely synchronized with my own now, and with each inhale, I felt more connected to my surroundings. The boundaries between my body and the forest seemed to blur and fade. The bioluminescent motes grew more numerous as I walked, swirling around me like fireflies caught in a gentle breeze. They cast just enough light to illuminate the path ahead, which now wound between trees so ancient their trunks were wider than houses. These elderly giants seemed to lean in as I passed, their branches reaching down like curious fingers to brush against my shoulders and hair. Time lost all meaning as I walked. Minutes or hours might have passed. I couldn't tell. The forest's breath had become my breath, its rhythm my rhythm. I felt as if I could sense every root beneath the soil, every leaf trembling in the canopy above. The forest was alive in a way I had never fully understood before, not as a collection of individual trees, but as a single, vast, breathing entity. I came at last to a clearing I had never seen before, though I thought I knew every inch of these woods. Here the trees grew in a perfect circle around a small pool of water, so still it mirrored the star-filled sky above. The bioluminescent particles swirled more densely here, creating patterns that seemed almost like writing in an ancient, forgotten language. Kneeling beside the pool, I gazed into its depths. The water was crystal clear despite the darkness, and as I looked closer, I could see something moving far below the surface. Not a fish or any other aquatic creature, but rather a slow pulse of light that matched the breathing rhythm of the forest. Up from the depths it came, then back down again, like the beating heart of the entire woodland. A warm breeze rustled through the clearing, carrying with it a whisper that might have been words in a language too old for human ears to properly hear. The message it carried settled into my mind not as sounds, but as feelings. Ancient, profound, and impossibly vast. I understood then that I had been granted a glimpse of something far older and more mysterious than I had ever imagined. As I made my way back through the forest that night, following a path that somehow led straight to my cabin, I felt fundamentally changed. The woods continued their slow breathing, but now I could feel it even through the walls of my home. Each night since then, I've felt that same rhythm, that same pulse of life flowing through every tree and plant. Sometimes, in the depths of night, I hear that ancient whisper again, calling me back to the clearing with the pool. I've never found that clearing again, though I've searched countless times. But the forest's breath remains, a constant reminder that there are mysteries in this world far deeper than we imagine. Even now, as I write these words, I can feel it, that slow, steady rhythm of life that runs through every root and branch. The forest breathes, and in its breath, it carries secrets that can only be felt, never fully understood. Some nights, when the moon is full and the air is still, I sit on my porch and listen to the breathing of the forest. The rhythm calms me, reminds me that I'm part of something vast and ancient. And sometimes, if I listen very carefully, I can almost make out words in that mighty exhale, ancient truths carried on the breath of the woods, waiting for those who are ready to hear them. The forest continues its eternal breath, in and out, rise and fall, and I continue to listen, knowing that some mysteries are meant not to be solved, but simply to be experienced. In the end, perhaps what the forest had been trying to teach me all along, that there is wisdom in simply being present, in breathing in harmony with the living world around us, in accepting that some things will always remain beautifully, wonderfully unknown. Story 8. The gentle waves lapped against the shore in a rhythmic melody that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. I sat in my weathered wooden chair on the beach, watching as the setting sun painted the clouds in soft shades of amber and rose. The evening air carried the sweet, briny scent of the ocean, mingled with tropical flowers, a fragrance that had become as familiar to me as my own breath during my months on this remote island. My small radio, powered by its hand crank, emitted only static, as it had since the day I'd arrived. Yet tonight, something about its white noise felt different. The random hiss and crackle seemed to form patterns, like whispered words just beyond comprehension. I leaned closer, adjusting the dial with careful precision, though I knew from countless previous attempts that no stations reached this far out to sea. The breeze rustled through the palm fronds overhead, their shadows dancing across the pristine white sand. In the growing darkness, the stars began to emerge, impossibly bright and numerous in the absence of artificial light. The constellation patterns here were unlike any I'd known before, as if even the heavens themselves were different in this isolated corner of the world. I had chosen this self-imposed exile, seeking solitude after years of chaos in the modern world. The island provided everything I needed: fresh water from a spring, fruit trees, fish in the lagoon, and blessed silence. But lately, that silence had begun to feel alive, as if it carried meaning beyond the mere absence of sound. The static from the radio shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. Within its random noise, I began to distinguish what sounded like voices singing, so faint I might have imagined it. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, reminiscent of whale songs, but with an unmistakably human quality. I checked the radio's batteries, but the crank gauge showed plenty of power. As darkness settled fully over the beach, the singing grew slightly clearer. The voices seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, from the radio, from the waves, from the very air itself. The words, if they were words, remained just beyond understanding, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. I closed my eyes, letting the strange music wash over me. The temperature had dropped slightly, as it always did after sunset, and I pulled my light jacket closer around my shoulders. The singing wove itself into the natural sounds of the island, the soft shushing of the waves, the whisper of palm fronds, the distant calls of night birds. Everything seemed to be part of one grand symphony. Opening my eyes, I noticed something unusual. Tiny points of light, like fireflies but more blue in color, had begun appearing along the shoreline. They pulsed in perfect rhythm with the mysterious song, creating patterns that mirrored the constellations above. I had never seen bioluminescence quite like this before, despite my months of observing the island's nightlife. The lights began to spread, moving up from the water's edge in graceful swirls. They danced through the air like underwater creatures freed from gravity's hold, leaving trails of soft radiance that lingered for moments before fading away. The sight was mesmerizing, beautiful rather than frightening, though I knew it defied all natural explanation. As I watched, the light seemed to form shapes, suggestions of human figures moving in slow, eternal dances. They were transparent, ethereal, more like living sculptures made of starlight than anything solid. Their movements matched the rhythm of the singing that now filled the air completely, though still just quiet enough to seem like it might be my imagination. The radio's static had transformed entirely into music, though the dial hadn't moved. The sound quality was perfect, unlike any broadcast I'd ever heard. It was as if the radio had become a window rather than a receiver, opening onto something vast and ancient and beyond my understanding. I found myself standing, though I couldn't remember deciding to rise. The singing pulled at something deep within me, awakening memories that couldn't possibly be my own. Memories of vast oceanic migrations, of cities that had never seen the sun, of dances performed in the depths where light couldn't reach. The glowing figures moved closer, their dance becoming more intricate. I could almost make out faces in their shifting radiance, faces that seemed both completely alien and oddly familiar, like relatives seen only in old, faded photographs. They moved with inhuman grace but profound intelligence, performing what was clearly a ritual or ceremony of tremendous significance. Time lost all meaning as I stood there, watching the dance of lights and listening to their song. The stars wheeled overhead, but I couldn't tell if minutes or hours had passed. The air grew thick with the scent of salt and flowers and something else, something ancient and deep, like the smell of stone chambers sealed for millennia. Gradually, I became aware that the figures were trying to show me something. Their dance had taken on a pattern, like a language written in light and movement. They seemed to be pointing out to sea, then up at specific stars, then back to the shore in a repeating sequence. With each cycle, the pattern became clearer, though its meaning remained elusive. The singing changed subtly, becoming more urgent though no louder. The words were almost comprehensible now, almost but not quite. They seemed to be inviting me to join them, to step into their dance and learn the truth about this island and what lay beneath its peaceful surface. I took one step forward, then another. The sand felt different under my feet, more solid than before, almost vibrating with energy. The lights swirled around me, their glow reflecting off my skin until I seemed to shine as they did. The boundary between observer and observed, between reality and dream, began to blur. Just then, a distant rumble of thunder broke the spell. I looked up to see clouds gathering on the horizon, despite the countless stars still visible overhead. The glowing figures began to fade, their dance becoming less distinct. The singing softened, returning gradually to static, though the melody lingered in my mind. As the first drops of rain fell, the light spiraled back toward the ocean in a final, breathtaking display. They merged with the waves, their glow persisting beneath the surface for several long moments before fading completely. The radio fell silent, leaving only the sound of rainfall and waves. I stood there in the gentle rain, watching the spot where the lights had vanished. The ocean looked normal now, its surface broken only by raindrops and the eternal rhythm of waves. But something had changed, in the island, in me, in the very fabric of reality. Making my way back to my small shelter, I carefully placed the radio on its shelf. Through the window, I could see the storm moving closer, lightning illuminating the clouds in brief, brilliant flashes. The rain grew stronger, but its sound was soothing rather than threatening, as if the island itself was trying to ease me back into the ordinary world. That night, as I lay in my bed listening to the storm, the song echoed in my memories. Even now, I couldn't recall its exact melody or whatever words it might have contained, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would hear it again. The island had shared one of its secrets with me, and I suspected it had many more to reveal. In the following days, everything appeared normal. The radio remained silent, the beach showed no sign of the mysterious lights, and the nights were filled only with stars and the usual sounds of the island. But sometimes, when the moon is full and the tide is high, I catch myself humming a tune I shouldn't know, and I see faint blue reflections in the waves that don't come from any earthly source. I no longer sit on the beach simply to escape the world I left behind. Now I wait, patient and expectant, for the next performance of that otherworldly orchestra. The island has become more than a refuge. It's become a doorway to something larger and more mysterious than I could have imagined. And sometimes, in those moments between sleeping and waking, I could swear I hear distant voices singing, calling me to join their eternal dance beneath the waves. The radio still sits on its shelf, silent but full of possibility. I keep it wound, ready to receive whatever messages might come through. And as I write these words by candlelight, watching shadows dance on my shelter's walls, I wonder if perhaps I didn't choose this island at all. Perhaps it chose me, recognizing something in my soul that made me ready to hear its song, to witness its mysteries, to become part of its endless, enchanting story. Outside, the waves continue their eternal rhythm, and somewhere beneath their surface, I know the dancers are waiting, their song unheard but unending, their light hidden but never extinguished. They'll return when the time is right, when the stars align and the veil between worlds grows thin. And this time, perhaps, I'll understand more of their message, learn more of their dance, unlock more of the island's infinite mysteries. Until then, I remain here, both observer and participant in this gentle haunting, this beautiful mystery, this song of the desert island that plays on in endless, echoing refrains. Story 9. The grandfather clock in the foyer marked each heartbeat of the house with its gentle ticking, a sound that had become both comfort and companion during my solitary evenings. Rain whispered against the window panes, creating a soft percussion that merged with the clock's steady rhythm. The warm glow of my reading lamp cast shadows that danced across the worn pages of my book, their movement hypnotic in the quietude of the evening. I had inherited this old house from my grandmother 3 months ago, and since then, each night had brought its own unique symphony of creaks and whispers. The wooden floors would sigh beneath my feet, and the wind would hum through the eaves, creating melodies that seemed almost intentional in their composition. Tonight, however, something was different about the house's nocturnal song. At first, it was barely perceptible, a faint musical note that wove itself between the familiar sounds of settling wood and evening rain. It reminded me of the sound a wine glass makes when you run your finger along its rim, but softer, more distant. The note hung in the air like morning mist, neither growing louder nor fading away completely. Setting my book aside, I closed my eyes and focused on the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very walls were humming. The temperature in the room remained constant, yet I felt a subtle change in the air, like the moment before a summer storm, when everything becomes still and expectant. My grandmother had been a musician, her piano the centerpiece of the living room for over 50 years. When she passed, the instrument had been donated to the local music school, leaving only a slightly darker rectangle on the faded wallpaper to mark where it had stood. Yet somehow, the house still held echoes of music within its walls. As I moved through the rooms that evening, the mysterious tone followed, changing subtly with each space I entered. In the kitchen, it harmonized with the gentle dripping of the faucet. In the study, it seemed to resonate with the crystal paperweight on my desk. The sound wasn't frightening. Rather, it felt like being wrapped in a familiar blanket, the weight of memory and melody pressing gently against my skin. Opening my grandmother's old chest of drawers, I found her journals, their pages filled with musical notations and cryptic symbols I didn't understand. She had always said that music was more than just sound. It was a language that spoke directly to the soul, a bridge between the physical world and something deeper, more mysterious. The rain grew heavier outside, its rhythm now a steady drumbeat against the roof. As I sat on the edge of my bed, reading through her journals by lamplight, I discovered pages where she had written about the house itself. She described it as an instrument, its rooms and corridors carefully designed to create specific harmonics. The placement of every window, the height of every ceiling, the length of every hallway, all had been calculated to produce particular resonances. My fingers traced the diagrams she had drawn, maps of sound waves and architectural features that looked more like sheet music than building plans. According to her notes, the house was designed to play itself under certain conditions, when the temperature and humidity aligned perfectly with the phase of the moon and the pressure of the air. As midnight approached, the single note began to change, splitting into 2, then 3 distinct tones. They wove together in a gentle counterpoint that made the air vibrate with an almost visible intensity. The sound reminded me of the lullabies my grandmother used to play on quiet evenings, when the world outside grew still and time seemed to slow its steady march forward. Standing in the center of the living room, I could feel the music moving through me like a gentle current. The shadows cast by my lamp began to pulse in rhythm with the sound, creating patterns that seemed to follow some ancient choreography. The house was singing, using its very structure as a vast architectural instrument. Through the windows, I watched as the rain transformed into a fine mist, each droplet catching the moonlight like suspended musical notes. The boundary between sound and sight, between memory and present moment, became increasingly fluid. I remembered my grandmother telling me that true music exists in the spaces between notes, in the silence that gives meaning to sound. The house's song continued through the night, never growing loud enough to disturb, but maintaining its gentle presence like a lullaby sung from a distant room. As I drifted between wakefulness and sleep, I began to understand that the melody wasn't new. It had always been there, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. Morning arrived with the same quiet grace that had characterized the night. The mysterious melody faded with the dawn, leaving behind only the usual sounds of the house, the ticking clock, the settling floors, the whisper of wind through the eaves. Yet something had changed, not in the house itself, but in my perception of it. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice patterns in the house's subtle music. It would sing most clearly on rainy nights when the moon was full, its melody changing with the seasons and the movement of stars. Sometimes I would catch fragments of familiar songs in its harmonies, pieces my grandmother used to play, transformed and abstracted by the house's unique acoustics. I never found a complete explanation for the phenomenon in my grandmother's journals, though her notes hinted at architectural principles dating back to ancient temples and medieval cathedrals. Perhaps some mysteries aren't meant to be fully understood, but rather experienced, like music itself. The house continues its nightly performances, each one unique yet somehow familiar. I've learned to recognize the subtle changes in air pressure that precede these concerts, the way the shadows deepen just before the first notes emerge. Some evenings, when the conditions are just right, I sit in my grandmother's old reading chair and close my eyes, letting the house's melody wash over me like a gentle tide. Visitors sometimes ask if I ever feel lonely in such a large house by myself. I just smile and tell them that a house filled with music is never truly empty. The melody continues, night after night, a reminder that some of the most profound mysteries in life are the ones that surround us every day, waiting patiently for us to learn how to listen. Each evening, as I prepare for sleep, I think about my grandmother and wonder if she knew what she was really leaving me. Not just a house, but a living instrument, a portal to something beyond ordinary understanding. The music plays on, soft and constant, a bridge between memory and mystery, between the tangible world and whatever lies beyond. And on particularly quiet nights, when the moon is full and the air is heavy with rain, I sometimes think I can hear my grandmother's piano joining in the house's song, its notes weaving through the architectural melody like threads of silver in an ancient tapestry. In these moments, the boundary between past and present grows thin, and I understand that some places are more than just spaces we inhabit. They are instruments through which the universe plays its endless song. Story 10. The gentle patter of rain against the window panes filled my study with a soothing rhythm as I sat working late into the evening. The old brass desk lamp cast a warm glow across my notebooks, its light barely reaching the corners of the room where shadows gathered like old friends. Outside, a dense fog had begun rolling in, transforming the familiar landscape of my garden into something altogether different, something softer and more mysterious. I had always found comfort in these quiet moments, when the world seemed to slow down and time itself became more fluid. The house creaked and settled around me, its aged wooden bones adjusting to the dampness of the autumn night. The scent of Earl Grey tea wafted up from my favorite porcelain cup, mingling with the musty aroma of leather-bound books that lined the shelves. It was then that I first noticed it, a faint luminescence floating in the fog beyond my garden wall. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of light, perhaps a reflection from a passing car or a neighbor's porch light. But as I watched, the glow remained steady, neither moving nor fading, hanging in the mist like a pearl suspended in milk. The longer I observed it, the more it seemed to pulse with a gentle rhythm, almost like breathing. The rain continued its soft percussion against the glass, but now it seemed to be keeping time with that distant light. I found myself setting aside my work, drawn to the window by an inexplicable curiosity that felt both foreign and familiar. Rising from my chair, I approached the window, feeling the slight drop in temperature as I neared the glass. The floorboards whispered beneath my feet, their ancient grain smooth against my wool-socked steps. As I drew closer, the light seemed to respond, its glow intensifying ever so slightly, as if acknowledging my attention. The fog had grown thicker now, transforming the garden into a dreamscape of soft edges and muted colors. My carefully tended roses had become abstract shapes, their form suggested rather than defined. The stone path that wound through the garden was now just a slightly darker ribbon in the mist, leading toward that mysterious glow. I found myself reaching for my coat, which hung on the old oak rack by the study door. The wool was slightly damp from my earlier excursion, and it carried the crisp scent of autumn air. As I slipped it on, I noticed that the house had grown unusually quiet, as if it too was holding its breath, watching to see what I would do next. The walk down the hallway to the back door felt longer than usual. Family portraits on the walls seemed to follow my progress with painted eyes, their faces half hidden in shadow. The antique grandfather clock in the foyer had stopped at some point, its pendulum frozen mid-swing, though I couldn't remember when I had last heard its familiar chime. The brass doorknob was cool against my palm as I turned it, and the hinges sighed as I opened the door to the garden. The fog immediately enveloped me, its touch like cool silk against my skin. The air was heavy with moisture, carrying the rich scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Each breath felt substantial, as if the very air had gained weight and presence. My footsteps were muffled as I made my way down the stone path, guided by memory more than sight. The light remained constant, neither growing nor diminishing as I approached. Small droplets of water collected on my coat and in my hair, not quite rain but more than mist. The roses brushed against my legs as I passed, their thorns gentled by the fog. As I drew closer to the garden wall, I began to notice other details. The light seemed to be accompanied by a barely perceptible hum, more felt than heard, like the distant memory of a song. The air grew noticeably cooler, and I could see my breath forming ghostly patterns in the illuminated mist. The wall itself had almost disappeared in the fog, reduced to a suggestion of stone and ancient mortar. The light hovered just beyond it at about the height of my chest. Now that I was closer, I could see that it wasn't simply a formless glow. There seemed to be structure within it, patterns that shifted and changed like oil on water. Standing before it, I felt an overwhelming sense of recognition, though I couldn't have explained why. The light pulsed gently, and with each pulse, memories that weren't quite memories flickered through my mind, fragments of dreams perhaps, or echoes of forgotten experiences. I saw faces I almost knew, heard voices that seemed familiar yet strange. Time became uncertain. I couldn't have said how long I stood there, watching the light dance in the fog. The rain had stopped, though water still dripped from the leaves and branches around me. The garden had fallen into complete silence. Even the usual night sounds of insects and distant traffic had ceased. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the light began to change. The patterns within it became more complex, more deliberate. They reminded me of writing now, of ancient scripts flowing and transforming. I felt that if I could just focus more clearly, I might be able to read what was being written in light before me. I took one step closer, and then another. The stone path had ended, and my feet sank slightly into the soft earth of the flower bed. The roses parted around me, their wet leaves brushing against my coat. The light was so close now that I could feel a slight warmth emanating from it, contrasting with the cool fog. Something made me reach out my hand, though whether it was curiosity or some deeper compulsion, I couldn't say. As my fingers approached the light, the glow seemed to reach back, tendrils of luminescence extending toward my outstretched hand. The air between us felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Just before contact was made, a sudden gust of wind swept through the garden. The fog swirled and parted momentarily, and in that brief clearing, I caught a glimpse of something beyond the light, a suggestion of other gardens, other paths, other possibilities. The light flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing there, mirroring my pose, their hand also outstretched. Then the fog rushed back in, thicker than before. The light dimmed gradually, like a candle being carried away down a long corridor. I stood there, hand still extended, as it faded from view. The garden remained silent, but it was a different quality of silence now, expectant rather than empty. I made my way back to the house, my feet somehow finding the stone path without difficulty. The fog began to thin as I approached the back door, which stood open just as I had left it. The warm light from my study spilled out into the garden, a beacon guiding me home. Later, as I sat back at my desk, I noticed that my tea had gone cold. The clock in the foyer suddenly chimed midnight, its sound startling in the quiet house. I looked out the window, but the fog had lifted, revealing my garden in its familiar nighttime aspect. Only the roses seemed changed. In the light from my desk lamp, I could see that they were covered in an unusual amount of dew, each droplet catching and holding the light like tiny stars. And if those droplets sometimes seemed to shift and swirl with familiar patterns, well, that was probably just a trick of the light. Yet sometimes now, on quiet rainy evenings when the fog rolls in, I find myself drawn to the window. I watch and wait, my breath fogging the glass, hoping to catch a glimpse of that mysterious light. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see a faint glow in the distance, calling me back to that moment of almost connection, that threshold of understanding that hovers just beyond reach. The roses in my garden have bloomed more vigorously since that night, their petals carrying an iridescent quality I had never noticed before. And on very still evenings, when the fog is thick and the moon is hidden, they seem to pulse with a gentle light of their own, as if remembering something they once witnessed, something they're not quite ready to reveal. I've never told anyone else about what happened that night, but I've started keeping a journal by the window, ready to record any future appearances of the light in the fog. Its pages remain empty so far, but the pen stays uncapped, waiting. And sometimes, when I'm working late and the fog rolls in, I swear I can feel a familiar warmth emanating from those empty pages, as if they too are waiting for something to illuminate them.